Good evening, class. This is my discussion post for week 3. I do not think that the U.S. could have achieved all its goals that Jacob stated for the Middle East in the time period covered. Um, a, the time period covered between the 1930s and the 1960s. Really, he kind of goes back to the World War One, to post World War One. The U.S. was dealing with a lot of other issues at the time. Uh, the Depression, World War II coming about, and then post World War II era of dealing with the rebuilding of Europe and things along those lines. So the U.S. had quite a bit on its plate when it came to the Middle East, and although some of the goals obviously were achieved, the protection of oil has always been achieved. We've always been able to sort of really control oil coming out of the Middle East. Um, and the defense of communist expansion was at least semi-successful, even though Egypt did kind of decide that they wanted to buy Russian arms, mostly not necessarily as an embrace of communism, but mostly as a sort of mistrust of U.S. policy. Um, I think the reason that the U.S. couldn't achieve all these goals at once is, at least in part, because of their failure to understand the dynamics of the region. Um, as we saw in the book, the different approaches taken between liberal development, which worked, but then, the modernization theory with the state trying to directly send money to the states, there were never defined goals, and that's what ended up being the U.S.'s downfall in achieving all of its objectives. There were never defined goals. It was inconsistent policy. Uh, you know, for a while, we'll support this economic development and this building up of these oil industries, and then 2 years later, we don't want to do that anymore. If private businesses do, that's fine, but no, we're going to give money directly to the state. And then maybe we decide after a couple more years that that's not really working, so let's go back to the liberal development thing. And then with the Palestinian conflict being thrown in the mix, uh, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the post-World War II era, things became even more complicated. Now the U.S. wants to look good by supporting the Israelis, but that's obviously making all the Arabs very mad. So now what is the U.S. supposed to do? They still want the oil, still got to watch out for this communist expansion. So the U.S. kept kind of shooting itself in the foot. Plus, it failed to understand the volatility of the region and the multiple other aspects that kept flaring up whenever the U.S. would try a new policy. Um, so I would say, just the short answer is no, they could not achieve all of those objectives listed because of an inconsistent policy. They, the U.S. foreign policy makers, were coming up with too many theories about what to do, and then the U.S. would apply them inconsistently. The Eisenhower administration would apply them inconsistently. Administrations before and after him, the book started to talk about Johnson in the late 60s. It was all inconsistent. The U.S. was never doing the same thing for long periods of time. So therefore, that's the reason it could not succeed in the region.